Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, June 6th, 2022. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the East Coast of the United States. My guest today is a Judging Freedom regular, Jack Devine. Jack spent his entire career in the Central Intelligence Agency and knows a great deal about Russian influence in the United States and what our intelligence community knows about what the Russians are up to. And he's written books about it. His great book is called The Spy Master's Prism. Once you start the book, you can't put it down. Jack, it's always a pleasure. Thanks, and welcome back to Judging Freedom.
Well, thanks for having me back on, Judge. I always enjoy it.
Thank you. So you and I have spoken several times during the course of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and each time you are of the view that the Russians will win. And of course, you can't always tell how it's going at the time we talk. But what's your view today, about 102, 103 days into the war?
Well, I didn't think they were going to win in the sense of occupying. And what I wasn't sure of is on the eve of when they invaded, just how vigorously the Ukrainians would fight. But I called a very good friend of mine who's well wired there, and he said, "Jack, we're going to fight." So I actually believe they're going to fight. That they would be as successful as they have been is a real surprise, and that the Russians have been so feckless on the ground in terms of having an army and logistics. I mean, that the first 70 days was pretty abysmal, and I think it was a shock to the world, including those that watch it closely in the intelligence world. So I've actually been thinking for a long time that you end up with a stalemate, maybe not a ceasefire, but the Russians they haven't done it yet. There's a point where, they moved everything out of Kiev, and now they're down in the eastern corner. They're going to push as hard as they can, and the Ukrainians are going to push back as hard as they can. And I think once they get to that point, they can't go any further, and the Ukrainians can't push it back anymore. Then I think you end up with a stalemate. I don't think at this point it'll be a negotiated settlement, because I don't think either party can negotiate. But you can tone down without a treaty. In other words, you just stop firing as many rounds and you get off the air a little bit. So I don't think we're too far. The other thing I would say to finish that off, Judge, I don't think we're too far out. I think before Thanksgiving, if not before Labor Day, I think they're going to be near stalemate. You can see certain things falling into place. There's a limit to how far the Russians can go and how far the Ukrainians can.
What does President Putin need in order credibly to claim victory? By credibly, I mean so that enough people in his own government believe him that he'll still be the president of Russia a year from now.
I don't think he can. In order to do that, I think the Kiev government would have to fall, and he would have to take the capital and most of the country. And there's no indication whatsoever that he has that capability. So I think he'll declare a victory that he has the eastern corner, the two provinces there. But that's as far as it goes. And frankly, he had unofficially sort of claimed that earlier. So I don't see it's within grasp anymore. And I think your point about a year, I wrote this op-ed that we talked about on March 2nd saying his days were numbered. I didn't mean literally the next 5 days, but his days, and he's over. I mean, he cannot come back as a powerhouse in his country, around the world, and it's just a question of time. It'll be his own people that bring him down. So a year is not a bad bet. I wouldn't take that. I mean, that's not unrealistic for where.
Is he forever going to be an outcast in the European community, or will he at some point come back into their good graces?
How can he come back after the atrocities? In other words, if there was a war in which it was fought traditionally and it was evenly balanced, you could say, well, we could work his way back. After the atrocities and the vicious bombing, and he can't work about who's going to have their picture taken of him. I mean, really. I mean, he's in his own country. I think he's going to have a hard time developing the stature. Before he went in, it was his high point. That was my thesis, and it remains my thesis.
Is it a normal in a limited war like this? By limited, I mean limited to one country versus another. This isn't World War II. For one side to lose 11 generals, is that a coincidence, or are the Ukrainians, perhaps with assistance from the West, targeting the Russian senior military leadership?
Well, 11 is a significant number, and there's no question about it. But they have a different structure. Their structure doesn't give the captain, the major, and the lieutenant colonel a lot of authority. So if you don't pass down the authority, then their general has to get closer to where the action is. And I think that distinguishes their model from our model. The second thing is, and I'm not professing I have inside information, but clearly the Ukrainians have been training. And actually in the book, I go into this. I said, and that was 2018, that they're not the army of 2014. They've learned some lessons, but they may not have received all the sophisticated weapons and the amount, but they were clearly have been trained to fight this kind of war, where I think the Russians were still fighting, going through the bulge type of war strategy. So I think that a lot of their techniques, I don't think the Russians were ready for it, frankly. There's no indication that they had any idea of what they were against. At some point, we should talk about the Stinger, just because of its, and I want to make a point about.
Well, I do want to talk
about what modern weapons changed the battlefield.
Okay, I do want to talk about those weapons in this context. Putin has warned the West that he may do something if he's obviously saying this for consumption in the United States, continue to arm the Ukrainians. What is this threat, and what could he possibly do?
Well, what he can do is talk loud, and he will get reception from people in the West and the East that are fearful. Let me put it this way. I told you last time, I think I made a mistake because I sort of went along with the idea that, well, maybe we shouldn't put those MiGs in. And when it was discussed in Poland, I thought, wait a minute. Why not? What's he going to do? Oh, he's going to invade Ukraine? He's going to invade Poland, but after what he just showed? I mean, I think it's a lot of bluster. Now, he'll fire off rockets and do damage and blow up buildings, but he has no pushback. He can't make progress in Ukraine. How's he going to make it in Germany and Poland? And I mean, so, what is he going to do? I mean, I think we have to be careful, because he threw out the word nuclear weapons, right? Everybody gets panicked. Really, you're going to fire one off? What do you think is going to be left of the Kremlin? I mean, it would be the end of my civilization as we know it. But so I think we have to take these threats. He is a good propagandist. I'll give him that. And disinformation, the Russians have been working at it much more effectively. We really don't engage very much. Americans they don't like disinformation. And
Jack, what have we gained by $56 billion in cash and in military equipment sent over to Ukraine?
Well, I think I would reverse the issue in the sense of what would have happened if we hadn't provided either the training or weapons.
The war would have been over in a month.
Right. And we would be looking at the thing that people really need to study is just how important Ukraine is in the history of Russia. Every Russian leader has lusted after Ukraine because it's the breadbasket of in many ways of Europe, but it's also, an industrial power. It was. It had nuclear weapons not too long ago. But a point that I would make is Russia, again, its GDP is like Spain or France with the Ukraine. And if Ukraine were fully developed, you would have a much stronger, the Germans would have a hard time with it. In other words, in terms of, that would be a much more formidable threat in Europe. And the big thing that has emerged from this, Judge, is I don't think Putin, as bad as I viewed him as a danger, he's worse than I thought. I'm sure he didn't like Spy Master's prison because I'm pretty tough on him. But he has shown himself to be ruthless an imperialist in a real old-fashioned style. So I wouldn't want to be sitting in Hungary, Estonia, Poland. In fact, I think he'd be aggressive in Latin America and maybe even in our own backyard.
What is the American intelligence community telling the president and the people around him about Putin today? His mental stability, his physical health, his stability in office.
I don't know what exactly they're saying, but I would be surprised if they and me are not far apart in our assessment of the danger he still represents, and his mindset. And I think probably they and me have probably sharpened our concerns about his ability or willingness to take life in large numbers and seem not to care too much about that. So I think on that score, about him and his stability, my guess is they're going to come out the same way, which is he's over. When it all turns to crumbles, who knows? But he has shrunk. He is shrunken as a threat to the world. In the sense of, his bluster. I mean, who's going to be afraid of him after you see how his army acted in a neighboring country and he still couldn't get it done, let alone trying to transport it somewhere else. I mean, amazing. So my guess is their assessment isn't too far apart. I hope it isn't.
Do we have boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, I will say this. We do not have any uniformed American troops on the ground. That would be my guess. But that you have really smart advisors that are Americans, I'll bet you do.
So how
I would hope that there'd be a way to lend support. Look, I'm a big advocate. Book 1, book 2, I talk about covert action, and that is those types of things you do without putting boots on the ground in armies. And that's what I did in Afghanistan with many of my colleagues who, I don't mean me, but a generation of people from the agency. But no, you're better fighting wars covertly, right? Where you have the local people want to fight, they have an adversary, you support it to the maximum, and you don't put troops on the ground. So I'm not a big fan of what we did in Iraq, and I didn't like the way it turned out in Afghanistan because I think we went in too early with real army. So if there's folks on the ground, it's sort of my vision of how you do things without getting toe to toe in the shooting a kinetic war against the Russians. And
you and I have talked about this. Somebody on the president's team either intentionally or let it slip that special forces, American special forces, were sent to Kyiv to protect the embassy. Now that's a joke. Special forces don't guard buildings. Special forces are offensive in nature. So if they're there, are we not risking the slow, gradual Vietnamization of this war?
I could be wrong. I don't think there's a single American enlisted man or officer that's firing any weapons at the Russians. Okay, that you better have tightened up your military presence. I mean, if you have I don't know how many guards Marine guards you had there, but who've always served their country bravely. But once he invaded and you still had people there, you better fortify because your embassy can be overrun, as we saw in Vietnam and other places. So that we would send in, and people talk loosely about he's a member of CIA when they actually mean he's in DEA or DIA. When they say special forces, were they really special forces? I don't know. But what they really should have done is tighten up the embassy, and I bet they burned a lot of documents and prepare for the worst. Remember, the U.S. government, at least as I read it, was offering Zelensky a free plane ride out of Ukraine, but fortunately he saw the situation quite differently and stayed. Thank God for all of us. But there was pessimism about the ability to hold Kiev.
I'd like to know what Joe Biden's real thoughts are. I don't know that you can tell me this, because that 56 billion is going to be gone pretty soon. You mentioned Stingers. Have we sent them weapons that are powerful enough that they can reach into Russia? And does that terrify Vladimir Putin? And if it does, what's he going to do about it?
The reason I mentioned the Stingers, Judge, is, we were running a war for about 8 years before the Stingers went in, right? And if you go back and read the press in 1985, it was the Russians were winning. The Mujahideen was running out of steam. If you talk to the political elite in Washington, they would have told you the same thing immediately. What happened is the Reagan administration decided they were going to make one big push. I happened to be chief of the task force at the time, fortuitously. But what happened? That one weapon system went in, and the first 3 helicopters. I remember going to see Director Casey and showing him the photos of the shoot downs, and their strategy changed. They started flying way above the range, and then they were ineffective on the battlefield. And that's when the Russians started to plan to leave. Now, that was the first time Stingers were introduced. What happened in this war, you don't hear as much about air power as you did in years gone by. Why? Because the Stinger, takes out helicopters, and so they were there. We put the Stingers in. We put the Javelin, which is anti-tank. And when I was in the Afghan program, we were looking for the Milan missile to take out tanks. So those things were terribly, terribly important, and that's why I don't think the Ukrainians would have been able to fight on without those 2 weapon systems. Your question is, okay, now we're 100 days into it, and artillery is now the key and the range of it. So the Russians can sit there and fire artillery, and the Ukrainians can't fire back because they don't have the range. Everything that's said publicly by the president and the administration is those weapons are on their way to them. And I don't blame Putin for jumping up and down. So don't you dare do that. But I am glad that the administration sees it for what it is, and that is, what are you going to do about it? Why don't you back off? Why don't you pull out? Why don't you stop, slaughtering these people? Why don't you back off, and then you wouldn't have to worry about whether we put them in or not.
All right. We'll have you back soon, Jack. You said maybe Labor Day, maybe Thanksgiving, but over by Christmas?
The stalemate between both the Russians, that would be my bet. By Christmas, everyone's going to be exhausted. I mean, the support among the allies is, it's going to be tenuous. Here in the United States, if we run into some of the economic headwinds, it's going to be tenuous. But remember, Putin is looking in the mirror, and he's not going to get any stronger. His economy's not going to get any better. Fewer deaths on this battlefield are not going to happen. He's not going to really regain much territory. So I think at a certain point, you're at a stalemate. And is there a brilliant statesman who could come in and cut a deal? Maybe. I haven't seen him, but that's possible. I'm more inclined to think it just, sort of dries up little by little. And then once the fighting's over, then everyone in Russia looks at him, and including his own leadership. And there's a lot of division in Moscow, quiet as it may be, about what a mistake this was.
Well, once the fighting's over, they're going to have to contend with guerrilla warfare, the likes of which they've never seen.
Well, that's the point. How far down can you turn it? I mean, that's going to be a really good question. And you don't have the guerrilla warfare unless you think you're going to gain something, right? I wouldn't be in other words, if Russia dials down, you have to be careful about forcing them to dial up. So will there be guerrilla warfare? I think all along they've had very good tactics. So I hope the Ukrainians, at some point, we recognize it's like a judge, this, in settling a case, there's a line, and when both parties will agree, right? You know it. And if someone misses it, it gets really messy for a long time. So I think we're looking for that type of settlement where, it's not going to get better. It's only going to cost us more. But he's slow. Putin's slow at it. And the Ukrainians have every reason to be angry and wanting to preserve their integrity of their territory.
Jack Devine, always a pleasure. You're always welcome here. Thanks very much, my friend.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.